It was a Tuesday morning, ordinary to most, but not to him. The cafe buzzed with the quiet hum of early workers, the hiss of espresso machines, the shuffle of newspapers, the muted conversation of strangers escaping the chill outside. Then he walked in. Marcus Hale, the billionaire, the man whose name was carved into skyscrapers and whispered in boardrooms with equal parts awe and fear. He wore arrogance the way others wore, cologne, thick, suffocating, impossible to ignore. His tailored suit, sharp as broken glass, announced him before his voice ever did. People noticed him. They always did. He liked it that way. Behind the counter, baristas straightened their posture. Customers lowered their gazes. The air shifted when Marcus Hale entered a room, like gravity itself had tilted in his favor. But in the corner, near the restrooms, a man knelt on the floor with a mop and bucket. David Carter, the janitor. His brown skin glistened with sweat under the fluorescent lights. His hands were rough, calloused from years of labor. His uniform, blue, faded, and slightly too big, hung loose against his wiry frame. David hummed softly to himself as he worked, his voice low and steady, almost drowned out by the clatter of cups. Cleaning floors wasn't glorious, but it was honest. And in his heart, David knew dignity was not defined by a title. But Marcus saw none of that. As Marcus strode toward the counter, his polished shoes struck the rim of David's mop bucket, sloshing dirty water across the freshly cleaned tiles. He stopped, looked down, then up, his gaze locking on the janitor. And then it happened. The sneer, the laugh that wasn't really laughter, more a weapon sharpened over years of belittling others. Unbelievable, Marcus said, loud enough for the whole cafe to hear. A grown man on his knees, mopping floors. Pathetic. The words hung in the air like smoke. Conversations froze. The barista's hand paused mid-pour. Customers shifted uncomfortably, pretending to read their newspapers, but their ears burned with every syllable. David looked up, his eyes wide but silent. He said nothing. He had learned long ago that speaking back often led to worse. Marcus leaned closer, smirking. You spend your life scrubbing what people step on, and you wonder why the world walks all over you. A ripple of cruel laughter escaped Marcus's throat, echoing against the cafe walls. David's hand tightened around the mop handle. His pride stung, his chest heavy with the familiar ache of being reduced to nothing more than the color of his skin and the weight of his labor. But still, he held his silence. And in that moment, Marcus Hale believed himself the victor. To him, it was nothing, just another casual cruelty, another reminder of his own supposed superiority. He left the cafe with his coffee in hand, never looking back. But for David, the wound lingered, because words can stain deeper than water ever will. And though Marcus Hale didn't know it yet, the man he mocked, the man he humiliated before strangers, would one day return into his life in a way he could never have imagined. That was the morning when a billionaire mocked a janitor. It seemed small, forgettable, but it was the beginning of everything. The cafe door closed behind Marcus Hale, and just like that, the billionaire was gone off to boardrooms, private cars, and his high-rise world of steel and glass. For him, the moment had already vanished, insignificant. But inside, the air remained poisoned. David Carter still knelt on the floor, mop in hand, as whispers flickered like flames through the cafe. No one spoke directly to him, but their silence screamed louder than any insult. Customers stared into their cups, pretending not to notice. The barista fumbled with coins, her hands trembling. One man shifted uncomfortably in his chair, as if he wanted to intervene but didn't. No one ever did. David swallowed hard. His throat ached with words he could not say, words he had learned to bury. He dipped the mop back into the bucket, his hands shaking, and tried to keep working. But every motion felt heavier, as though Marcus's words had seeped into the water, weighing down each stroke. Pathetic. On your knees, scrubbing what people step on. The echo replayed in his head, over and over, like a cruel refrain. It wasn't the first time he'd been mocked. Not the first time someone looked at his brown skin, his janitor's uniform, and decided he was less. But something about this moment cut deeper. Maybe it was the laughter. Maybe it was the way people looked away. Or maybe It was the reminder that the world often sided with the man in the suit, not the man with the mop. When David finished his shift that night, he walked home in silence. His shoes squeaked against the wet pavement, his uniform still damp from dirty water. He passed neon signs, empty bus stops, and the glow of apartment windows where families ate dinner together. But at home, there was no time for bitterness. His wife, Angela, was waiting at the table with 2 bowls of soup. His teenage son, Jordan, sat with a textbook open. Frustration etched across his face as he wrestled with algebra. David forced a smile. He kissed his wife on the forehead, ruffled his son's hair, and sat down. He didn't mention the cafe, didn't mention Marcus Hale. He kept it tucked inside, locked away. Because fathers, he believed, should carry burdens quietly. But pain has a way of leaking through the cracks. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, David replayed the scene again and again. The billionaire's laughter, the way customers avoided his gaze, the feeling of being invisible except as the butt of a cruel joke. He wondered what Jordan would think if he had seen it. Would his son lose respect for him? Would he see his father as weak, humiliated? David turned to his side, clenched his fists, and whispered to the dark, "I am not what he said I am." And yet, deep down, a small part of him, an exhausted, weary part, felt the sting of doubt. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus Hale sat in a leather chair in his penthouse suite, sipping brandy by a wall of glass that overlooked the glittering city. He had already forgotten about the janitor. To him, it had been nothing more than background noise in a day filled with acquisitions and meetings. But cruelty has ripples. And while Marcus drank in the skyline, the echo of his laughter still clung to David like smoke. The man in the suit had left the cafe untouched. The man with the mop had carried the wound home. One believed he had all the power. The other carried all the weight. But life has a way of turning tides. And soon, Marcus Hale would learn that words don't vanish when spoken. They return. Sometimes years later. Sometimes with a vengeance. High above the city, where the streets looked like veins of light, and the people below shrank into ants, Marcus Hale reigned in his kingdom of glass and steel. To the world, he was the very image of success. The billionaire, the mogul, the untouchable man. His face appeared on magazine covers, his name in headlines, his words quoted by business schools that worshipped at the altar of wealth. At conferences, they called him visionary. At parties, they called him genius. And Marcus believed them all, because arrogance, once fed, becomes hunger. And Marcus Hale was always hungry. Every morning, he stood before the mirror, knotting a silk tie with the precision of a soldier preparing for war. His reflection wasn't just a man, it was an illusion. The immaculate suit, the watch worth more than a year's rent, the smirk that promised both charm and cruelty. But mirrors don't tell the whole truth. Because beneath the silk, Marcus was restless. Beneath the smirk, Marcus was afraid. David Carter was a man of few words. Not because he didn't have thoughts or opinions, he had plenty, but because life had taught him that silence was sometimes safer. Silence at the supermarket, when the cashier watched him more closely than the man ahead of him. Silence in job interviews, when they said, "We'll call you," and never did. Silence in the cafe, when a billionaire mocked him before strangers and no one spoke up. David had learned to swallow words like bitter pills, and though his silence protected him, it also carried a weight, a heaviness that bent his shoulders, etched lines into his face, and sometimes followed him home like a shadow. At work, David was invisible until something went wrong. A spill on the floor? A clogged toilet? Suddenly, all eyes were on him. But when the floor gleamed, when the tables shone, when the air smelled of lemon and bleach, no one noticed. Invisible. That was the life of the janitor. But invisibility came with a cruel twist. When he was noticed, it was often for the wrong reasons. His uniform, his skin, his place. At home, David was more than a janitor. He was a husband, a father, a man trying to build something lasting out of very little. His wife, Angela, worked part-time at the library. Her voice was gentle, her eyes kind, though they often carried the same exhaustion he did. Together, they stretched paychecks like magicians, turning scraps into dinners, making sure their son had what he needed even if it meant going without themselves. And then there was Jordan, 16 years old, bright, restless, dreaming of a future bigger than the walls of their small apartment. David saw in his son both hope and danger. Hope because Jordan was brilliant, capable of breaking free from the cycle of labor and silence. Danger because he feared the world would break him down the way it had broken David. One evening, Jordan came home fuming, tossing his backpack onto the couch. "Dad," he said, his voice sharp, "why do you let people talk to you like that? Why don't you ever stand up for yourself?" David looked at his son, saw the fire in his eyes, the defiance he once carried as a young man before the world taught him its rules. "I do stand up," David said quietly. "I stand up by coming home every night, by putting food on this table, by keeping my job when men like Marcus Hale want to see me lose it. Sometimes, standing up looks like staying silent." Jordan frowned, frustrated. "That's not standing up. That's letting them win." David's chest tightened. He wanted to tell his son everything, that the world was rigged, that pride could cost you your paycheck, that dignity sometimes had to be carried in secret. But he couldn't crush Jordan's fire. He wouldn't. So instead, he just sighed, placed a hand on his son's shoulder, and said, "One day, you'll understand." That was David Carter's burden, to endure racism not with fists or fury, but with patience, with silence, with the quiet hope that his sacrifices would carve a smoother path for his son. But silence has a weight, and weight, carried long enough, can break even the strongest of men. Meanwhile, in his glass tower, Marcus Hale laughed at a board member's nervous mistake, slicing the man's dignity with the same ease he had sliced David's. For Marcus, cruelty was sport. For David, cruelty was survival. Two men, two worlds, bound by a moment neither could forget. On a mocking, one enduring, and soon silence would give way to a reckoning. That was David's truth. A man crushed by the weight of silence, yet carrying more strength than the billionaire who mocked him could ever imagine. His empire, though vast, trembled at its foundations. Whispers of lawsuits, partners threatening to defect, numbers on quarterly reports that didn't shine the way they used to. Investors, once eager to bask in his shadow, now cast wary glances. And yet, Marcus told himself none of it mattered. Money could bury truth. Lawyers could silence dissent, and arrogance could disguise weakness. So he wore his mask like armor, and the world applauded the performance. But arrogance de ma victime. And Marcus found them everywhere. At board meetings, he mocked junior executives for stuttering over presentations. At charity galas, he rolled his eyes at waiters too slow with his wine. At interviews, he dismissed entire communities with the flick of a phrase. It was the same cruelty he had unleashed on David Carter in the cafe, just another performance, just another reminder that he was above them all. Marcus thrived on power the way others thrived on oxygen. And without it, he feared he might suffocate. The narrator leans in, almost whispering. What Marcus could not see, what he refused to see, was that power built on cruelty is power built on sand. The tide was coming, and when it rose, it would wash away the mask. Far below his glittering tower, in a modest apartment across the city, David Carter tucked his son into bed. His hands still smelled faintly of bleach. His back ached from hours of scrubbing. But when Jordan smiled at him, David felt something Marcus Hale never could. Peace, purpose, love. The billionaire had money. The janitor had meaning. And soon, their worlds would collide again, in ways neither of them could yet imagine. That was the truth of Marcus Hale. The world saw a king, but behind the mask, he was a man already losing his crown. Marcus Hale's empire stretched across cities and skylines. His companies touched everything from real estate to finance, from tech startups to luxury brands. For years, his name had been synonymous with growth. Investors trusted him. The media celebrated him. Competitors feared him. But cracks had begun to appear. It started with numbers. Reports that were supposed to shine came back dull. Growth projections slipped. Profits shrank. Stock prices wavered. In the boardroom, smiles grew thinner, and questions grew sharper. At first, Marcus brushed it off. Markets fluctuated. Numbers rebounded. He had weathered storms before, and he believed this would be no different. But the storm did not pass. A lawsuit landed on his desk, filed by former employees who claimed they had been mistreated, ignored, discarded. One case turned into three turned into 7. Lawyers assured Marcus they could bury it all, but headlines started to circulate. The press no longer called him a visionary. They began calling him ruthless, corrupt, dangerous. At a gala, whispers followed him from table to table. Investors who once clamored to shake his hand now kept their distance. His phone, once buzzing with opportunity, began to ring less. Inside his tower, the tension grew thicker. Executives who once echoed his every word began pushing back. They questioned decisions. They challenged his strategies. Behind closed doors, some whispered of replacing him. One morning, Marcus sat in his penthouse office. Floor-to-ceiling glass surrounding him in every direction. The city sprawled beneath him, but it felt different now. Not like his kingdom, more like an ocean, vast and threatening. He watched the stock ticker scroll across the giant screen on his wall. Red numbers, dropping by the second. His empire, his life's work, shrinking before his eyes. Marcus gripped his glass of whiskey, but his hand trembled slightly. For the first time in years, he felt the edge of something he could not control. That afternoon, as he walked through the marble lobby of his building, a reporter's voice called out from the crowd, "Mr. Hale, how does it feel to watch your empire crumble?" The cameras flashed. The question hung in the air. Marcus didn't answer. He kept walking, his face set in stone. But the words clung to him, following him out into the waiting car. The man who once mocked others for being beneath him now felt the ground shifting beneath his own feet. His tower still stood, but the foundation was beginning to tremble. The hospital became Marcus Hale's cage. Weeks passed in sterile rooms filled with white walls, fluorescent lights, and the constant rhythm of machines. Every morning began with a nurse checking vitals. Every evening ended with doctors updating him on the waiting list. The answer was always the same: no donor yet. Keep waiting. Marcus grew restless. He paced the room when his body allowed it. He stared out the window at the parking lot below, watching families arrive and leave together while he remained trapped inside. One night, unable to sleep, Marcus stepped into the hallway. His chest ached from the effort, and his legs felt weak, but he wanted to move. The hallway was quiet, lined with patient doors. Some rooms glowed faintly, machines humming inside. Others were dark, curtains drawn. As he shuffled past the nurse's station, he heard a voice. A doctor and a nurse spoke in hushed tones, reading from a chart. "David Carter, room 213. Conditions deteriorating. He'll need surgery soon if we can stabilize him long enough." The name froze Marcus in place. David Carter. He repeated it silently, his mind pulling back to the cafe, the mop, the bucket, the look in the janitor's eyes when Marcus had mocked him. He walked closer, pretending to be on his way to the elevator. As he passed, he glanced at the open chart on the desk. The name was clear: David Carter. His chest tightened, not from his condition, but from recognition. The next day, curiosity gnawed at him. He asked a nurse casually, "The man in 213, what's wrong with him?" The nurse hesitated. "I can't share other patients' information, Mr. Hale." But Marcus already knew enough. The man was here. The janitor. The same one he had humiliated. That evening, Marcus found himself standing outside room 213. The door was ajar, and inside, David lay in bed. His skin was pale, his frame thinner than Marcus remembered. A woman sat at his side, holding his hand tightly. A teenager sat in the corner, a textbook in his lap, though his eyes weren't reading. Marcus stood in the hallway, hidden in the shadows, watching the family. The image unsettled him. The man he had reduced to nothing with a few cruel words was now fighting for his life. And Marcus, powerful billionaire, was doing the same just down the hall. Later that night, Marcus lay awake in his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. The name repeated in his mind. The cafe replayed in flashes. His laughter, the silence of the room, the humiliation etched on David's face. The past had followed him here. The man he mocked was no longer invisible. And now, their lives were bound by something neither of them could control. Room 213 smelled faintly of antiseptic and flowers. A vase sat on the windowsill, holding wilted daisies brought days ago by a neighbor. The machines beside the bed beeped steadily, the sound both comforting and heavy. David Carter lay propped up against a stack of pillows. His chest rose and fell slowly, each breath a small effort. His once strong hands that had pushed brooms, lifted tables, and carried trash bags for years, now trembled when he tried to lift a glass of water. Beside him sat Angela Carter, his wife. Her eyes carried exhaustion but also fire, the kind that kept her seated by his side every hour of the day. She adjusted the blanket across his chest, smoothing the fabric, as if her touch could shield him from the weight of his illness. At the foot of the bed, their son, Jordan, sat hunched over his notebook, 17 years old, with ambition written into the lines of his focused face. His textbook lay open to a chapter on biology, but his pen hadn't moved in minutes. His eyes flicked constantly to his father, as though every sound, every cough, could shatter him. "Don't stop studying, son," David's voice rasped, breaking the silence. His smile was faint but firm. "You'll do what I never could. You'll make it further." Jordan nodded, blinking quickly to keep his composure. "I'm not going anywhere. I'll study here." Angela reached over, taking her husband's hand. "You've carried us for so long, David. It's our turn now. We'll carry you through this." David's eyes softened. He turned toward her, his gaze lingering on the strength she carried in her shoulders. She had worked 2 jobs when his hours were cut. She had stretched meals when money ran thin. She had never let despair enter their home. The beeping of the machines filled the pause. Angela looked up at the small window, the city lights faint through the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, lined with fatigue. She closed her eyes for a moment, whispering a prayer only she could hear, a prayer for time, for mercy, for a miracle. Outside in the hallway, Marcus Hale stood once again at their door. He had no reason to be there, yet he found himself drawn to the sight. Through the gap in the door, he saw the family, saw the way Angela held David's hand, saw the way Jordan sat, refusing to leave his father's side. Their unity unsettled him. He thought of his own penthouse, vast, silent, empty. He thought of boardrooms filled with voices but no warmth. He thought of the nights he had sat surrounded by wealth, yet utterly alone. Angela's eyes lifted, sensing movement near the door. For a second, her gaze met Marcus's through the gap. Her eyes were steady, unwavering. They carried no fear, only strength and a quiet demand. "Who are you? And why are you here?" Marcus turned away before she could rise to check. His footsteps echoed down the hall as he retreated to his own room, but her eyes lingered in his mind long after. Eyes that had seen suffering, eyes that had carried burdens, eyes that held him accountable without a single word. The hospital's corridors hummed with the sound of rolling carts and low voices. Marcus Hale sat upright in his bed, restless. His chest still ached from the episodes, but his mind pressed heavier than his body. The name David Carter had followed him for days. Finally, he made a decision. That evening, after the nurses completed their rounds, Marcus slipped from his bed. His body moved slower than he liked, the IV pole rattling as he wheeled it down the hallway. Each step sent a faint throb through his chest, but he ignored it. He stopped at room 213. The door was half open. Inside, David Carter rested against his pillows. His breathing was shallow, a mask covering his nose and mouth. Angela sat beside him, her hand never leaving his. Jordan was asleep in the chair, his head tilted, textbook still in his lap. For a long moment, Marcus only stood at the threshold, his shadow stretching across the floor. Then David stirred. His eyes opened slowly, cloudy with fatigue. He turned his head toward the doorway. His gaze found Marcus. The recognition was instant. The silence stretched between them. Years collapsed into a single moment. The cafe, the mop, the cruel words, the laughter that cut deep. David's lips parted, dry and weak. His voice was hoarse but clear. "You." Marcus stepped inside, his hand tightening on the IV pole. He opened his mouth, but no words came. His throat felt heavy. Angela sat straighter, her eyes sharp. "Who are you?" David raised a hand slightly, silencing her before she could rise. His eyes never left Marcus. "I know him," he said, breath trembling. "From before." Marcus finally spoke. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the beeping machines. "I remember. Angela looked from her husband to the stranger, trying to piece together the invisible thread connecting them. David coughed, his body shaking under the strain. When he steadied, his gaze hardened. "You mocked me." The words were not loud, but they cut through the room. Jordan stirred awake at the sound, lifting his head, confusion flickering across his face. Marcus swallowed. He did not deny it. He could not. "I did." Silence filled the room. The machines kept their steady rhythm, indifferent witnesses to the weight of truth. Angela's eyes narrowed, the fire in them rising. "Why are you here? Haven't you done enough?" Marcus stood still, his face unreadable. "Because I needed to see him." David studied him, searching his features, seeing the toll the hospital had taken on the man once untouchable. The billionaire before him was no longer surrounded by power or armor. He was pale, fragile, human. "Life has a way," David whispered, "of bringing men low." Marcus held his gaze, but his hand trembled slightly on the pole. For the first time since the cafe, they stood on equal ground, two men stripped of pretense, both fighting battles their wealth or poverty could not change. The hospital days blurred together. Marcus remained on the transplant list, his name buried among countless others. His condition worsened. His strength slipped away. Every breath reminded him that time was no longer measured in years, but in days. In room 213, David Carter's decline was sharper. His body, already fragile, began to fail. Machines breathed for him more often than his own lungs. Angela stayed at his side, her hand gripping his as though sheer will could hold him here. Jordan barely left the room, textbooks unopened on his lap. The doctors spoke in quiet tones. Both men needed miracles. Neither had guarantees. One night, Marcus sat upright in bed, his chest aching. He stared at the ceiling when a knock broke the silence. The door opened, and a doctor stepped inside, clipboard in hand. His voice was low. "Mr. Hale, there's been a development." Marcus' heart quickened. "A donor?" The doctor hesitated. "Yes, a match has come through." Marcus exhaled heavily, relief flooding him. But then the doctor continued. "The match is David Carter." Marcus froze. The words struck harder than any headline, any lawsuit, any fall from power. David Carter, the janitor, the man he had mocked, the man lying only a few rooms away. In room 213, David's condition had taken a critical turn. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow. Angela leaned over him, tears sliding silently down her face. Jordan gripped his father's other hand, whispering words of encouragement he wasn't sure his father could hear. When Marcus entered the room, the air shifted. Angela rose immediately, fire flashing in her eyes. "You have no place here." Marcus's voice was unsteady. "I heard about the match." Angela's face hardened. "You think his suffering will save you?" David stirred at the sound, his eyes opening weakly. His gaze moved from Angela to Marcus. He seemed to understand without explanation. The room fell silent, broken only by the hum of machines. David's voice was faint, almost a whisper. "If my life ends, and yours continues, then let it not be wasted." Marcus stood frozen. The man he had humiliated was offering, in death, what Marcus could never buy in life: another chance. Angela's tears fell harder. Jordan turned his face away, unable to look at the man who had once reduced his father to nothing. The doctors entered quietly. Time was short, papers were signed, consent was given. The surgery took hours. Under bright surgical lights, David Carter's heart was carefully removed. It beat its last for him, then was carried into another room, into another body. Marcus Hale awoke days later, weak but alive. Machines still surrounded him, but his chest now carried a steady rhythm that was not his own. He sat in silence, staring at the ceiling, the weight of what had been given pressing harder than the weight of what had been lost. Down the hall, room 213 was empty. The daisies on the windowsill had withered completely. The bed was stripped bare. Weeks later, Marcus stood outside the hospital, cane in hand. He watched Angela and Jordan leave the building, their faces drawn but steady. For a moment, his lips parted, as though to speak, but the words never came. Angela's eyes met his briefly. Her gaze carried sorrow, strength, and something unspoken, a demand that he prove himself worthy of the heart that now beat inside him. Marcus lowered his head. The billionaire who once mocked a janitor now lived because of him, and every beat of his heart carried the weight of that truth.